Hello again, as you know, I'm Eli the Computer Guy, and this is episode 328, Introduction to Type 1 Hypervisor Virtualization. So today we're going to be talking about Type 1 hardware, bare metal virtualization of computers. So basically what this means is you create a virtual environment on a server so that you can run numerous different operating systems at the same time on the one piece of hardware. So we've talked about virtualization in the past, and essentially the idea with virtualization is you contain the entire operating system in its own little cocoon, its own little shell, and then you can move that operating system around and do things with it just as easily as you would as with a file or a document or a movie, so on and so forth. So there are two different types of virtualization, and there's two different types of hypervisors in general. There's a type 1 hypervisor and the type 2 hypervisor. The type 1 hypervisor, what we're going to be talking about today, is when you have a hypervisor that just allows for the bare minimum amount of virtualization and nothing else on a piece of hardware. Type 2 hypervisor, a hosted hypervisor, what that means is you actually install a full-fledged operating system onto the hardware, and then you install the virtualization software on top of that, and then you install the operating system into that virtual software. So if we're talking about VirtualBox, if we're talking about VMware Fusion, if we're talking about Virtual PC, you install VirtualBox onto a Windows or Mac or Linux computer, then you install the operating systems into VirtualBox. So what we're talking about today is a type 1 hypervisor, a bare metal hypervisor. What that means is you install the hypervisor onto the bare metal, just like you would a standard operating system, and then the instances of the operating systems, the virtual computers, go directly on top of that. Type 1 hypervisors are very, very, very useful for any number of reasons, and we're going to be talking about that today. So let's go over the whiteboard, and I'll try to explain a lot of this stuff out to you. So let me grab my little pen here. So when we're talking about a type 1 hypervisor, the idea is you have a piece of hardware. So you have your server, and then on top of that hardware you can have numerous different instances of different operating systems. So you can have an instance of Windows 7, you can have an instance of 2008 Server, and you can have an instance of Ubuntu, all sitting side by side on this server. So this way, instead of needing actually 3 separate boxes, one for Windows 7, one for 2008, and one for Ubuntu, you can put them all onto one box. The nice thing when you're dealing with the type 1 hypervisor is by having a bare metal hypervisor, you get a lot of functionality you don't get from a type 2 hypervisor. What you get out of a type 1 hypervisor is the ability to migrate these instances of operating systems between different pieces of hardware in real time, depending on which pieces of software you go with fault tolerance. What this means is with a type 1 hypervisor, if your instances of an operating system are sitting on this one physical box and this one physical box dies, these instances can automatically move to a different piece of hardware in this little virtual cluster. So depending on if a physical piece of hardware dies, they can get moved. If extra resources are getting used, they can automatically get migrated. So that the idea is that with a type 1 hypervisor, you can have an insane amount of reliability and redundancy, because if a physical piece of hardware fails, it will just automatically migrate the entire operating system to another physical box, and you don't even have to worry about it. It's completely automatic. You just get an alert, and then you fix the physical box whenever you want to deal with it. Now, how this works, the overall structure of this, you need to realize before you get into it. So the first thing that you have to have is you have to have storage of some type. So storage is where the actual data is going to reside or is going to be stored permanently. Now this storage can be on the hypervisor itself, the physical server itself, or if you're going to be doing the redundancy and the reliability, you would normally put it on a SAN or a NAS. So either a network area storage or a storage area network. So basically you have the storage. These are where the instances of the operating system will always be able to be stored. Then you have the type 1 hypervisor. These are the bare metal hypervisors. So you install the hypervisor onto the physical hardware, and this is where the operating systems, the instances, will be run on. Then after that, the one thing that confuses many people is then you have to use management software or a management console to administer the hypervisor or the numbers of different hypervisors. So when you install the bare metal hypervisor, the type 1 hypervisor, onto this hardware, all you are going to get is, at the end of it, you're going to get a lot of like text, something that looks like a lot like the CLI, and that's it. You can't manage the instances of the operating systems directly on these hypervisors. You have to go over to the management software, which will then control these hypervisors. So this is how it works. So you have storage, where everything gets stored. Then you have the hypervisors themselves, the physical pieces of hardware. And then you have the management software that will control the hypervisor. So today, to make everything simple and easier, I used a piece of virtualization called ESXI, VMware ESXI. The reason being is that the storage is very easily configured to be on the physical server that you're dealing with. I was going to show you guys Citrix, but with Citrix you have to create NAS and SAN and all that stuff, and that got way too complicated. So for you guys today, we will be using VMware ESXi. But the important part to remember is you have to have storage, then you have to have the hypervisor, then you have to have the management software that will control the hypervisors. So all of this is basically built off of something called Xen, X-E-N. Xen was a project, I don't know, it's pretty old now, well over a decade old. So this is completely open source virtualization software, and it is so good, basically almost all companies have ripped off Xen and just put a few little proprietary things to make it their own. The important thing to remember whenever you're going to be using a Type 1 hypervisor is, for the most part, the lowest end Type 1 hypervisors from any of the vendors is free. So if you're dealing with VMware, they have ESXi for free. If you deal with Citrix, they have Xen Server for free. If you deal with other stuff, there's other Xen servers for free. So essentially, this hypervisor here is almost always going to be free, which is very, very, very nice. Because it's all based off Xen. Xen is open source, so they can't really charge for it because nobody would pay. Where they are going to try to charge you money is in the management software that's going to be controlling the hypervisors. So the management software is what allows you to access the operating systems and administer the operating systems. The management software is what controls fault tolerance, what controls being able to migrate between different pieces of hardware, so on and so forth. So whatever piece of software you decide to use, it's almost always going to be based off of Xen. Xen's going to be free. The management software, there will always be a free version, but then you'll notice that the free version will give you very limited access, and then if you want a couple of fancy features, it'll cost you like $1,000, and then if you want really fancy features, it'll cost you like $3,000, and if you want like insanely fancy features, then it'll cost you like $5,000. It gets expensive really fast, but whenever you're going to be dealing with this, just make sure you realize that if you want to play with Xen and hypervisors and all that, it's free. And like with ESXi or even with Citrix, they normally give 6-day trials of their more powerful stuff, so you can play with it at will. So let's go over to my little workbench and show you something over here. So basically, over here at my workbench, I have set up my little crappy $400 gateway laptop to be the server. So this has VMware ESXi installed, and this is what houses my virtual servers. As I've talked about before, as I talked about in my server class, choosing server components, you know, servers don't have to be big mamma jamma servers, right? They literally can be just laptops. This is $400 laptop. The reason that I'm using this is because although it's not very powerful, it's something that, is very portable. It has its own battery in there. Basically, it does everything I need and is not loud and is not going to drain my electricity bill. This is just a very easy way I can create little virtual servers, play with them, do demonstrations, and then shut them down. No big deal. But basically all I did, again, this $400 gateway laptop, I bought at Best Buy 2 years ago. I put VMware ESXi on it, and so this is now the Type 1 Hypervisor server. Now I want to show you, if I can click this off so you guys can see, as I said, when you're dealing with the hypervisor itself, there is not much to see. So if I come up here, you will notice there's no Windows logos, there's no GUI, you can't do anything with the mouse. Basically all you've got is text. VMware ESXi, here's the IP address, here's the IP6 address, so on and so forth. So really from here there's not a lot you can do. I can hit F2, and if I go into F2, I can do things like change the network. Oops. Come on, help me out here. There we go. So we can change things like passwords, we can change things like the network configuration, so on and so forth. But you really can't do a lot from the hypervisor itself. This is one thing that throws a lot of new people for a loop, is because they're really excited to use a Type 1 hypervisor, they get it all installed, and then all they're doing is looking at text. So remember, you have to have the management software to control this. And again, we were talking about storage before. The instances of the operating systems have to be stored somewhere. Again, with ESXi, it's very easy to configure that right on the server itself. Not the most reliable, not the most redundant, but again, if you're just doing demonstrations or basic things, it works pretty good. So if we go over to the computer, I can show you how all of this works. So we're back at the Windows 7 computer. Now the main thing to remember with Type 1 virtualization is you are going to be virtualizing servers. I really want you to get that through your head, because a lot of people get things confused, especially when they're dealing with virtualization. Remember, with Type 1 hypervisors, you have numerous instances of the operating systems on a single piece of hardware. So all you want them to do is be providing services to the rest of the network. These are not computers you would be sitting down with and administering very often. So you may put an FTP server into a virtualized instance. You may do an Active Directory server. You may do a web server. Those types of things. Basically, you set them up, you configure them, and then once they are configured, you just let them go, and then every once in a while you open up a console and administer them. So when we go to administer them, again, any kind of these Type 1 hypervisors need a management console. So for VMware, we're going to be using something called vSphere. So we're going to transfer over here. And basically what you can see right here is there's a little icon called VMware vSphere Client. All I have to do is I can double click on this, and this will open up the little login to the VMware server, the hypervisor over there. So I plug in the IP address, 192.168.1.6. I plug in the username for the hypervisor, and I plug in the password. Then all I do is I click login, and this will log me in to the hypervisor. And now the hypervisor has opened up. This is a little evaluation thing. I just click OK. And so this is how I administer that Type 1 hypervisor over there. This gives me all kinds of configurations so that I can configure the virtualization server itself, and then I can configure the servers that are there. So if I open this up, I can see that I have one Ubuntu server that's already been set up. If I want to administer this server, I can go over, and there are a few tabs over here so that I can get information about it and be able to administer it. So I can go over here and I can look at the summary, So this tells me basic information about the server. I can look at resource allocation. I can look at performance. I can look at events. And then if I go over here to this tab console, this console tab is what allows me to interact with the server. So now that I'm in this console, I can literally just log on to the Ubuntu that's on the server. It's like 10.5 or something on there. And now I can interact with that operating system. So I can go in here, I can go up, I can go to accessories, I can go to terminal, and I can see what's going on. So I can do like top and see what the you know, what's going on with the system. Or I can hit Control C and I can do like sudo apt get install, I don't know, MySQL. And I just type in the password, and so this way I can go and I can try to install something like MySQL or Apache. So I've already actually installed Apache on here. I gave it the wrong command for MySQL. So basically, I am able to interact with this server however I want. So again, as I talked about before, or I just talked about, I installed Apache onto this server. So what I can do is if I go over to a web page, and this is a browser sitting on my computer. Since I know what the IP address of the server is, 192.168.1.7, if I go there, I can access the web server that is sitting on that virtual computer. So basically, when I create that virtual computer on the hypervisor, I connect it using DHCP, and it can get its own IP address, and it is talking on the network just like any other computer. So again, I could install 10 computers onto that one piece of hardware. They would all get their own IP addresses, and they would be communicating with the rest of the network just as easily as if they were normal pieces of hardware. The one thing to make sure you don't make a mistake of, though, is the 192.168.1.7 is the IP address of the Ubuntu server that I have virtualized. So if I go to this server and I hit ifconfig, we can go here and we can see that the IP address for this server is 192.168.1.7. Now, don't confuse that IP address with the IP address of the hypervisor itself. So the hypervisor, again, has its own IP address, 192.168.1.6. So if we go over to my web browser, if I accidentally type that in instead of .7, I would be getting the web page for the hypervisor and not the web page for the server that I'm trying to get to. So the nice part with VMware ESXI is if you go to the IP address of the hypervisor, it'll give you the ability to download a vSphere client. It gives you some documentation, so on and so forth. So remember, the IP address of the hypervisor is not the same as the IP addresses of all the servers that are on the hypervisor. All the servers that are on the hypervisor should have their own IP addresses, and you will access them that way. So if you're going to be using SSH, you would use the IP address of the server you're SSHing to, FTP, Apache, so on and so forth. Now, if we look at the hypervisor, again, basically it is pretty simple to be able to interact with these things. So from here, they have different buttons. You can do things like pause the hypervisor. You can stop the server. You can pause the server. You can restart the server. So right now, all I would have to do is if I hit this button, I can actually just power off the server, quote unquote, as if this was a server and I hit the power button. Now, if I want to create new servers, what I can do is I can go in here and I can do new virtual machine, and I can pretty simply just go in and configure a new virtual machine for whatever kind of server that I want to be doing. So if I want to create a Windows 2008 R2 server, I would just select some options here, select a network card, so on and so forth. And if I went through and canceled, that would create the storage, and it would create the overall instance, and then we would install the operating system onto that instance, so then you would have a virtual server. So that's really all there is to a Type 1 hypervisor in a nutshell. So Type 1 hypervisors, these are bare metal hypervisors that get installed right onto the hardware. There's no underlying operating system. You install the hypervisor directly onto the hardware. The hypervisor then connects to storage, where the instances of the operating system are stored. That can be in a SAN, storage area network. That can be in a NAS, network attached storage device. That can be connected to iSCSI. It can even be on the local server. That's why I used VMware ESXI. The hypervisor is then what runs the operating system. And then you have the management software with VMware called vSphere, which manages the different instances of the operating system. Again, with that management software, it can do really cool things where it can automatically, if one piece of hardware fails, it can migrate all the instances of the operating system over to a different piece of hardware that quick, literally so fast that the end users won't even know that it happened. Again, with this kind of virtualization, this is why I talk about things like redundant power supplies and RAID not really being useful for most people in the modern world. Why bother with redundant power supplies on your server or RAID on your server when you can literally just create a completely identical server, and if there's a hardware problem on one server, everything will get migrated in real time to the other one and you have no downtime. I would rather have 3 pieces of hardware where the instances of the operating system can bounce around between those 3 if there's any problems, versus having something like a redundant power supply. It's just not gonna make any sense, I don't think. Remember, when you're going to be dealing with these, when you go out and look, you're going to be seeing something called Xen Server, Xen. This was a Linux project. This was an open source project, and so the Xen Server is free. There's a lot of free open source, completely open source versions of Xen Server out there. I used ESXi, or there's Citrix Xen Server. There's a lot of stuff like that. The important thing is the management software. The hypervisor is almost always going to be free unless there's really something fancy about it. The management software, that is what can cost you money. Again, VMware, Citrix have free versions of the management software, but if you want any of the really cool functionality, that is going to cost you some money, because that's what's proprietary, and so that's what they can charge you on. Whenever you go out to buy a Type 1 hypervisor, do keep in mind the licensing requirements and what you are buying. Depending upon what the requirements are, it may cost you a lot more than you realize. So with some of the licenses for the Type 1 hypervisor, you pay for the physical box itself. So you pay for the box. So it'll be like $1,000 per license per server. Or you can have $1,000 per license per socket. So when we talk about servers being able to support multiple CPUs, every socket that is being used, every CPU that is being used, would then cost $1,000. And then in some cases, it's absolutely ridiculous, but you do have to make sure you know what you're talking about. I did see in the past where they charged you per core. So if you had 8 cores on one processor, you weren't paying $1,000 for that server. You were paying $8,000 for that server. Again, as I talk about the Eli the Computer Guy brand, why I'm here is to deal with you guys as professionals, to help you guys as professionals, and as real IT people, licensing is as, or possibly even more important than the actual technical skill behind setting this kind of stuff up. And so you have to be very, very careful. Make sure you understand what licensing you're buying and make sure you buy the right thing. Again, with these hypervisors, there are lots and lots and lots and lots of options out there for you. So if you read a licensing agreement, you don't agree with it, you don't like it, frankly you can't afford it, go and look for another option. There are other options. If you can't afford one, if you don't like one, you can go out and find something else, I swear. The worst case scenario, if nothing else, you can use this stuff completely for free. You just have fewer things you can do with it. So this was episode 328, Introduction to Type 1 Hypervisor Virtualization, Bare Metal Hypervisors. I'm Eli the Computer Guy. I enjoyed teaching this episode and look forward to seeing you at the next one.